Great. Welcome everyone to today's webinar series, A Place of Knowledge Exchange. Thank you for joining us and sharing your time with us. This speaker series is co-hosted by the College of Rural and Community Development and the International Arctic Research Center. To share collaborative approaches to research, education, and real-life community-based practices in rural Alaska. This speaker series is monthly, and this will be the final one for the spring semester. We will resume in the fall. And through this project, we have supporting facilitators who have connected with our featured speakers and are in the background facilitating and working on the logistics. These include myself, Margaret Rudolph, Jessica Black, and Santa Roach. In respect of the Indigenous peoples before us, and in now the physical space we share at UAF, we would like to start this webinar with a land acknowledgement. Everywhere we live and work is native land. We recognize, appreciate, and honor Indigenous peoples and their past, present, and future land stewardship. We are committed to building long-term reciprocal relationships with Indigenous organizations and knowledge holders to create relevant and actionable information in support of their sovereignty and self-determination. Today's speakers will talk about the intersection of well-being and fishery. We thank them in advance for sharing their knowledge with us today. Our speakers today are Harmony Jade, an Indigenous liaison with the International Arctic Research Center, Dr. Rachel Donkersloot, who is the owner of the Coastal Cultures Research, and Freddie Christiansen, who is board member of Old Harbor Native Corporation. Before we start, please note that our webinar is recorded and will be available for viewing later at the YouTube page of the College of Rural and Community Development. You can utilize the Q&A during the seminar, and our facilitators and speakers will help answer any questions that you have. The first part of our webinar is hearing from our speakers, while the second half is for answering questions. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Harmony Jade. Welcome, Harmony.
Thank you, Josie. Yeah, I'll kick this off by saying this work was part of my master's thesis, which I defended in 2022, so 2 years ago, when I was a student in Iceland at the University Center of the Westfjords. But my advisor was one of our other speakers here, Dr. Rachel Donkersloot. And the title of the thesis was Food Sovereignty as Wellbeing in Igiugig Village. You can go to the next slide. So first, I just wanted to say thank you to the community of Igiugig. Without their partnership on this project, it would have not been possible. And then you can just click through the other animations here. I just wanted to acknowledge our partners. That was Coastal Cultures Research, UAF, and the North Pacific Research Board. Yeah, I just wanted to give an introduction on myself and why I wanted to do this work in the first place. But yeah, my Yupik name is Sigrak, and my English name is Harmony Jade. And I grew up in Naknek and in Unalaska, but I have been fishing in Naknek for my whole life, commercial fishing for 12 years and subsistence fishing before that. So just kind of wanted to ground us in, and why we get involved in this work and where my passion comes from. And I was always told that when you eat your subsistence foods, they integrate into your spirit. And I kind of found my way home back to the project or back home to the region with this project after living abroad for quite a few years. Okay, now the next slide, and hopefully we can move forward from here. And I'll wait for a second. Okay. First off, I wanted to start off with the definition of well-being from the State of Alaska Salmon and People Project, and just emphasizing the underlined words here with sovereignty as a key theme, that it's equitably practiced, self-defined quality of life. And so often well-being is put forward as a policy objective in fisheries, but it's not clearly defined from an Indigenous community perspective and what it means. And I can bring my own like intersectional identity of working commercial fisheries, subsistence fisheries, and then now being a fisheries biologist, and how those all come together, but with the theme of sovereignty being the core, and power and agency that we often don't have. And the next slide. And so what does well-being look like in practice for me? I think of picking berries on the tundra and sea legs, moving throughout the seasons, and putting up salmon in my smokehouse with my family. But often different pictures of well-being come up to each different person, and what it means to live the good life. So I just wanted to put a few examples of what it is for me. The next slide. And another kind of conceptual model of well-being is from Crouch et al. 2021. And this is the goodness of life study from Alaska Native perspective. And so I wanted to emphasize here that with this work comes a lot of healing work as well, and healing of trauma specifically, and how everything is connected, and we can't just talk about a resource in a vacuum, but also resource in community, and how culture kind of overlays that. So this is a good model for that if you want to read the paper later on. The next slide. And this kind of in practice of bringing youth and elders together. And what I think is really important that we often don't think about in resource management is the social component, and that when you lose the resource like salmon in Bristol Bay, you lose the culture around that resource. You lose the coming together, the cutting fish together, the community that stems all from this one resource. And so these are photos from the Bristol Bay Native Corporation's annual culture camp, where we try to bring youth from the region out to the shores of Lake Iliamna to practice our traditional practices with elders, and then cutting fish in Naknek. And the next slide. Is it showing? Okay. Just a little bit of a lag. Okay. And so this is the key domains of well-being that was developed by Rachel Donkersloot in the paper Donkersloot et al. 2020. That is also in the State of Alaska Salmon and People Project with under the well-being tab. But in my thesis, I looked how food and food sovereignty specifically cross-cuts these domains of well-being and intersects it from an Indigenous point of view. And so I think the next slide is a video that we made that kind of summarizes the work in the thesis. But unfortunately, the sound, which was my voice of narrating, wouldn't come through the Zoom. So I think we have the closed captioning if we want to play that video, but also can put the links to our other 3 videos in the chat. It's a series. The first one's on Alaska Native hunting and fishing rights and review, and this one's on equity and well-being in fisheries. And the last one is on science and policy. So I'll put the link in the chat for folks to watch those on their own time as well. Thank you. Are we going to play the video, or we can move on to Rachel too?
Yeah, I was going to, but since you said to share the link, I'll just move on to Rachel's slide.
Okay, great. Thank you. I hope you guys can all hear me. Yeah, thank you, Josie, and thanks to everybody else who organizes this series. I'm really grateful to be here today and to be sharing this space with Harmony and Freddie. And I've worked with both Harmony and Freddie for a number of years now, and I continue to learn from them. And we have a large research team that's been doing this work for a long time. So today I wanted to share a bit about how we as a research team are thinking about and trying to advance equity and well-being considerations in fishery science, in fishery management, and in governance. And I think Harmony's talk set us up nicely. So I kind of wanted to start just by emphasizing a few of the key takeaways or the broad points to frame what motivates some of the work that we're sharing today. And for one, I think likely everybody on the line today knows the many ways in which fisheries contribute to well-being, be it socially, culturally, physically, spiritually, monetarily. At the same time, there's many examples of conservation solutions and top-down management decisions harming Indigenous communities across the globe, including here in Alaska, either through displacement from traditional waters or loss of access to resources or lost livelihood opportunities or the erosion of cultural practices. And I think that there's growing awareness of these kinds of well-being impacts and related inequities that have prompted calls to better account for well-being and better account for equity in fishery management and governance. And right now in particular, we're really experiencing an attention surge in these topics, which are increasingly identified as policy goals and as important dimensions of sustainable management. And this attention surge raises really important and challenging questions about who decides what to measure and how to measure it when it comes to well-being and sustainable governance. Do you want to advance the slide there, Josie? This is just a screenshot of the website for the larger State of Alaska Salmon and People project that Harmony mentioned. So this was work that I helped lead a few years ago. It brought together a truly amazing team of elders and fishermen, scholars, students, researchers, and we were collectively working to define and assess well-being. And we spent a lot of time exploring how to better account for well-being in fisheries as a community and culturally defined concept. And we were specifically interested in the utility of creating well-being indicators or metrics as a tool to better account for these considerations in management. And we were interested in this for two reasons, really. For one, it's well documented that there's high potential for misapplying and misinterpreting indicators in the context of Indigenous communities in particular. So is there a good way to do this, given how standardized sets of indicators may actually perpetuate inequities or really miss the mark in other ways? And I think the second thing that was really motivating this project was that much of our collective work centers on cultural values, on benefits, on cultural losses that are often unaccounted for in decision-making contexts because they're not easily measured and they're not easily quantified. And that kind of information tends to be ignored. So there's a lot of good information. There's good background information on this website. I think you can access that 2020 paper that Harmony mentioned. There's also a lot of links to visuals that we created and maps that we created in partnership with the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. They played a big part in helping us pull all that together. And there's also access to a data portal that has it contains a lot of information on Alaska salmon systems that some of you may be interested in. So just a heads up that you can access that at alaskasalmonandpeople.org. What I want to draw attention to here is the focus that we give to the social and cultural dimensions of fisheries that are especially difficult to quantify or that shouldn't be quantified. So what are the implications of ignoring or excluding the cultural diversity of our fisheries? And I'll reference just a few papers on the problems of measurement and the limits of data that speak to measurement as a political process, as a social process versus an objective or neutral or value-free process. And I recently served on a panel tasked with assessing equity in fisheries. And in our report, we write about how measurable data reinforces its own importance. So although we intend to measure what we value, we end up valuing what we can measure. And there's lots of good writing on this in recent years in particular, and I'd be happy to share those papers with the group if there's interest. Next slide, Josie. I do quite a bit of work in Bristol Bay, and I wanted to draw on it here because I think it helps illustrate some of the points that we want to make today. And limited entry in particular is a good example of a conservation solution or a management system that has harmed a lot of Indigenous communities. And that's despite some really good and explicit goals. Limited entry was meant to keep fishing rights in the hands of Alaskans, especially rural Alaskans with limited alternative opportunity. Limited entry was meant to support a stable economic base in our isolated and rural fishing communities. This image you're seeing is a report that I authored a few years ago now for the Nature Conservancy to try to historically, comprehensively, culturally unpack the misfit between village fishing economies and livelihoods and how we manage fisheries, and in this case, limited entry. Next slide, Josie. This is one of the visuals that we created through that SASAP project that I mentioned. And if you go to that site, we have maps, we have statewide maps, and we have maps of every region in Alaska if you wanted to take a closer look. But what you're looking at here is the Bristol Bay region. And you can see the red shaded dots are indicating communities in the Bay that have experienced permit loss. And the purple shaded dots are representing communities that have experienced an increase in permit holdings. So on the one hand, I think the Bristol Bay region in particular is a really compelling example. It represents the largest and the most valuable salmon fishery on the planet. And on the other, it's a site of crisis. It's a region of lost access. It's a region of lost livelihoods. And many of the factors contributing to this crisis and its ongoing impacts in the region remain poorly understood even today because of economic assumptions about why and how people fish, and because of a failure to account for what are often the qualitative, social, cultural, and community dimensions of our fisheries. And this is a main point that I hope you all take away from this today, is that the impacts of a governing logic that fails to account for community and fishery dimensions that are difficult to measure are oftentimes uniquely shouldered by Indigenous communities and other rural fishing communities. Next slide, Josie. This is my last slide. I wanted to share a little bit about our current project with Igiugig Village Council. This work focuses on Indigenous conceptions of well-being in particular. What contributes to well-being? What threatens well-being? Harmony shared a little bit about this, so I'll just make a few comments. But one thing I wanted to state here is that one of the most salient themes to emerge from this research was the role of sovereignty and self-determination in how well-being is expressed and practiced and achieved. So through this work with Igiugig, we learned about sovereignty in practice, and we learned about a range of nation building initiatives and how these initiatives, expressed in the language of nationhood, advance well-being through a renewal of sustainable human and non-human relations. And I've listed a few here in this blue bar. Harmony mentioned food sovereignty. That video that she attempted to show was about food sovereignty and well-being, but there's also examples of energy sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, language sovereignty, and territorial sovereignty. And we go into this in more detail. We unpack it a bit more in a paper that's forthcoming in the Journal of Ecology and Society that we've entitled Immeasurable Sovereignty. And again, I'd be happy to share that with folks once it's published. So a couple points, I think, just to wrap up before I turn it over to Freddie. But, you know, it's clear that we need greater investment, greater understanding, and greater inclusion of equity and well-being considerations in fishery science and in decision-making. This is critical work. This is basic work when it comes to assessing management impacts and outcomes. How do we know we're on the right track? And we're really underprepared to do that work right now. There are major shortcomings in scientific capacity and expertise in US fishery management. This is despite legal requirements to evaluate social scientific information, to evaluate local knowledge and traditional knowledge as best available science. And there's a recent paper, actually there's a presentation and then a forthcoming paper that Jeff Cast leads, who looked at workforce trends in NOAA, which is the federal agency that manages our federal fisheries. And he notes that less than 1% of NOAA scientists are social scientists, and economists make up 70% of that 0.9%. So I think when we're thinking about well-being and fisheries, we need to think about what data are collected, how are different types of data treated, how do we ultimately decide what's acceptable in terms of management outcomes. And there's a really good paper by Robin Gregory at UBC who talks about this and about how these types of decisions and this type of thinking, these are values-based trade-offs. And I think we need to be mindful of that, particularly as we're making more and more painful decisions in the context of our fisheries these days, given just the rate of change and uncertainty that we're dealing with. And in that paper I mentioned that's forthcoming in our paper, we also ask some fundamental questions related to whether creating new assessment tools, generating new data sets, and trying to better fit Indigenous values, Indigenous worldviews, Indigenous relationships as measurable data points in Western science and management is the best way to account for the well-being of Indigenous communities and other communities. Is that the best way to improve the quality of fishery governance and decision-making, especially given the growing body of literature that highlights the effective and the successful role of Indigenous governance in meeting these goals? So I think I'm going to end there. I'm going to turn it over to Freddie. I'm sure he's going to share some similar stories from his home region, but thank you all for your time today. Yeah.
Hey, Chimay, everybody. My name is Freddie Christiansen. I'm originally from the village of Old Harbor, a native village on the east side of Kodiak Island. I'm an Old Harbor Native Corporation board member, Alutiiq Tribal of Old Harbor, Nunjuk tribal member. I'm married. I got 3 kids, 2 son-in-laws, a daughter-in-law, and 7 grandkids. And, you know, I think it's important for me to mention that because a lot of people have, you know, kids or grandkids, and my work, you know, and involvement over the years has always been making sure that our people is represented in the context of making sure that we get our share of fish, because the economy base, and I show that picture there just to share that my youngest one in our family, is going to be the one to be the fisherman. I've identified him as that. But and it's the only reason I share that, because I'm doing work for them and everybody else's kids. I just feel that all the years of living in Old Harbor, I moved to Anchorage in 2004, I believe. And but my heart's always been home. I go home and advocate on behalf of our people from Washington DC and every place in between. Really, you know, without Courtney being here with me, I'm normally with her when we're doing this, and Rachel as well. But only thing that I know that I could explain is my experience, my lifelong experiences of the impacts of what Rachel was talking about, the state limited entry program. It was devastating to our people, and it took a long time to get there. But as when I was a young kid, we had like 7 or 9 of us boys that hung out together, and you know, ever since we were kids, we always wanted to be skippers and owners of boats. And but then, you know, we were born in 1960. Limited entry came into play in 71 and took those dreams away. And I mention that because it wasn't until I was in my early 30s that I reckon, early or mid 20s, and then seeing the real impacts of it by the time I was in my mid 30s, where 5 of those boys, or 4 out of 9 of us, had passed away by the time they were 35 years old, because I believe that their hopes and dreams were taken away from them, and that they didn't have an opportunity to be a owner and skipper of a boat, because we're coastal natives and we, you know, live by the sea and depend on the ocean and all the resources. Not only that, but we also protectors of the resource. And then limited entry, Alaska Native Land Claim Settlement Act, there was a lot of things happening. And then in the 90s, the individual fishing quota was passed. And that was the privatized or rationalized fishery of the federal side with the federal government, North Pacific Fishery Management Council. So compounded with both of those programs, on top of other things, you know, we have school closures in our villages, not Old Harbor, but we have 2 villages on Kodiak Island, and all of us are, you know, experiencing the same thing in our region. But the amount of people that have left the villages, because, you know, there was a rationalized system, programs that did not fit the native people. You know, unlike, you know, had we had a tribal fisheries, it would have been a different outcome 50 years later. And so I continue to advocate and try to restore some of our fishing access back for our people, as well as, you know, advocating education, because everything is all tied in, and everything's relevant in order to have a thriving community. My village of Old Harbor, when I was growing up, there was 35 boats in that village, and now we have 3. And that's the end result of rationalized programs that doesn't fit the native way of life. Excuse me, I gotta drink water, but at the end of the day, it's been devastating, not only to Old Harbor, but to every place else. And so I continue to advocate on behalf of our people, and truly believe that we will succeed under self-determination, and our tribal governments being part of that movement. I just feel very strongly about that. And I don't know if there's anything else I needed to share. I got so much. I've been doing this for a long time, and it's you know, the bottom line is that something has to be done. I mean, you see you know, I like the picture of the trawler one. We have an actual, the native people on Kodiak Island in the villages did not get a CDQ program, if you will, or any kind of allocation. And you know, if we fished during 86 to 91, I believe was the qualifying years, then you receive some, but it was never enough to make you know, a living off of it. It was some of the people. One of my neighbors was a good example of Patrick Androvich and his wife and kids and grandkids. You know, they commercial fished halibut during the Derby years, and because he wasn't greedy, because he just wanted to catch what he needed to survive throughout the winter, you know, he was penalized for that. And his getting 6,000 to 10,000 pounds a season, you know, 4 openers, you know, a year, he was penalized for his way of fishing. And I think he qualified for like 250 pounds of halibut IFQs. You know, there was absolutely, I'm mentioning this because I think it's important. There was absolutely no consideration whatsoever, all right down to the pound. There was somebody else in our village that got 37 pounds under the halibut IFQ program, but yet they have a 5 million pound commercial halibut bycatch fishery between the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska. And they're allowed to take, the trawlers are allowed to take the halibut as bycatch, the crab and what have you, but yet the native people are cut out on it. And I don't want to specifically point that out about the trawlers, but my point is that they could have a fishery, a bycatch fishery, but the native people can't have their own way of life, you know, fishery of what they've grown up doing. And I think that it's important for the future, and as we speak with our congressional delegation and the, you know, and the council and all the other players involved, that they start recognizing and realizing the impacts that, you know, these programs have done. When you've got a fleet of 35 boats down to 3 boats, you had a population base of only almost 400 people. We're down to a little over 200. Tremendous amount of substance abuse issues, tremendous amount of suicides, and et cetera, health issues. It's all, you know, attached to this economy base that we need in our communities. Without that, you know, we are a dying breed or a group of people, and that's what's currently happening. We've lost a tremendous amount of kids over my lifetime. I've lost a lot of people way younger than me that should still be here today, had the opportunity to be a owner or skipper of a boat, or had a future, had a purpose to wake up tomorrow morning. I think that the you know, the system has failed us, and I think my involvement is to help document and to help show proof that it has had a huge impact on us in so many ways. And then our elders in our communities, especially Old Harbor, which was one of my biggest supporters of my involvement, not knowing that they were looking at me as a very young child and supporting me, you know, knowing that, or feeling and knowing that one day that they would have a voice and I would be one of many, not just me, but a bunch of us. You know, I on behalf of our elders and ancestors and a resource, it's important for the Native people, the Indigenous people, to be, you know, in the coal management arena, and you know, in all of the, in education and everything. Without that, I just feel very strongly that the end result's not good. I've most recently made a trip to Washington, D.C. and advocating on behalf of our people again, and I feel that they're listening to us now, because it's the real, you know, it's not just Kodiak Island, it's everywhere. And I'm hopeful that the state will come on board and be supportive on some of things that, you know, that could be mitigated or changed or amended or whatever it's going to take to put these communities back on track. You know, even although I've lived in Anchorage for 19 years, I believe 19 or 20 years, that I've never really feel fulfilled when I wake up in the morning because I'm out of my element. And we you know, we talk about statistics. They always want numbers. Well, some of the a lot of the articles, a lot of the news reporting over my time living up here, you know, has been offensive. I've been offended by it, and I mean that by saying that when they talk about the amount of homeless people on the streets in Anchorage, Alaska, are 50, you know, what are we, 17% of the population base, but yet 50% of the people on the streets are Alaska Native. Incarceration, people that are incarcerated, I think 35 or 40% of the people incarcerated are Alaska Native. 40-50% of the suicide rates in Alaska or Alaska Native. And so my response to their reporting was that I would like them to take and be able to tell the story of why that's occurred. And I believe that this is part of the reason why this has occurred. We're displaced, forced out of the community, especially when you come from a community, 99%, 95% economy is based on fisheries or the ocean or the fresh water, the lakes, or whatever it may be. So I'll end with that. And I just want to thank you guys. And I'm heartfelt with my issue, and I'll be that way. So thank you, Koyana.
Thank you so much, Rachel, Harmony, and Freddie, for sharing your expertise with us today. I'll take a look at, yes, we have one question here. So the question is, my question is regarding the impact of commercial fisheries, regarding the impacts that commercial fisheries has on our region's well-being. This is something I've been trying to deal with in fisheries policy. We have an area of abundance while many of our friends and relatives are dealing with conservation concerns. How do we continue to build up and support each other with such differences in access and differences in our region's history and relationships to salmon? How might a well-being framework help bridge subsistence and commodification? So I don't know who wants to address this first.
I can try to address it a little bit. Yeah, I think it's something that I deal with as well, being involved in commercial fisheries and also subsistence fisheries, and yeah, being from Bristol Bay, where we still have such strong runs when friends and relatives are experiencing fisheries loss and crashes, and just the inequity that there is there. But also I feel like in Bristol Bay, and so much of my personal experience is around commercial fisheries as culture as well. Like maybe Freddie can relate to this too, in that a lot of my childhood and time with my family was spent on the skiff set netting. And then that was also a vehicle for subsistence as well, because we had to make money to fuel our boats, and then we have the boats to access subsistence and all of the equipment. So it gets a little bit muddied there as far as user groups and the division between commercial and subsistence, at least in my personal experience, and just trying to note how people have different hats, and maybe the same person wears quite a few hats in the village or in fisheries specifically.
I'm happy to add to that, if Freddie, unless you want to jump in, but yeah, okay, yeah. I mean, great question, Craig. I think Harmony hit on some really good points around the ways in which, commercial fishing opportunities in a place like Bristol Bay support the continuation and the existence of village-based livelihoods. And she referenced those mixed economies and the interrelationship between, commercial and traditional / subsistence opportunities. Steve Langdon has some really nice papers from 70s, 80s, and 90s talking about that relationship and really what motivates some of those smaller scale commercial fishing operations in places like Bristol Bay to support a continued way of life in their village. At the same time, you're asking a really difficult question, and like in a place like Bristol Bay and other coastal regions like Kodiak and elsewhere that have been able to benefit from commercial fisheries in a way that headwater people and upriver people have not. And I think at this particular moment, we're really seeing how difficult it is to have that conversation, to have that dialogue, because it's hard for people to hear and to foster understanding when you're in a state of crisis, and when you feel threatened and when you're scared or maybe unfairly judged or misunderstood. So, I think in some of the more recent meetings and some of the management meetings, whether state or federal, I think it gets away, it moves to some of what I was trying to talk about in the time I had around like Robin Gregory's paper on the pitfalls of science. Like, are we asking science to unfairly solve some of these problems, which should more be understood as values-based trade-offs? And you mentioned well-being, and the relationship between well-being and equity is fairly intimate. And right now what we're seeing is, how does all the science that we currently have available to us in these fisheries point to the fact that, say, there's just enough Yukon chum left out there in the Bering Sea for some commercial opportunity in the trawl fleet, commercial opportunity down the chain, but there's not enough Yukon chum left for the people of the Yukon. And that's a values decision point. That's an issue of equity and fairness and what we think is acceptable. So we really probably don't have a good answer for you, because if we did, we probably wouldn't be where we are right now in fisheries in the North Pacific.
I'm not on yet. There, I'm on. That's a very difficult question. I just got a little bit of it trying to, so the question was that how does commercial and subsistence, can they coexist together? Is that sort of the question? Yeah. Well, I think that, as, I'm empathetic of my Native brothers and sisters up north in every part in the state of Alaska. First and foremost, they should be able to get their foods that they need as part of their way of life, as part of their way. And I think that, I've always viewed this commercial fishing industry that we in Old Harbor, we in Kodiak Island, that we can coexist, because we have a different kind of landscape and ocean and unlike the Yukon Kuskokwim. But I've come to the conclusion that what they're dealing with the Yukon Kuskokwim, chum and king salmon decline, that this is not an old concern. This has been around for a long time. The problem with it, it's the one segment, one voice of all the people involved has not been heard. And that's been the Native voice. That's been the subsistence users. And it's finally coming to head. Now, people can blame our people, the Native people, that we're disrupting everything. But because of their ignorance, no respect, in my opinion, my observation, I've attended council meetings for off and on for the last 35 years. I just don't think that it was, the consideration was there, not trying to blame anything or the system or what have you. I just don't think that the seriousness of what the outcome was going to be, is what it is now. I think had they had listened to the Indigenous people, traditional knowledge, the last 20 years, the outcome would be different right now, but I'm not saying it's too late to get engaged and be involved, but the damage has been done, and I don't know what it's going to take to recover or bring it back to where the people in the Yukon Kuskokwim could just, I'm talking about a commercial fisherman side of me. I couldn't imagine going home and not being able to subsistence hunt or fish. You know, that would be devastating. Um, Commercial, you know, you have to accept that because we have our good years, we have our bad years. But subsistence purposes, I just don't know how our people in Old Harbor would deal with being cut off from a way of life, a subsistence way of life. So I'm empathetic and very considerate, but I always feel that had they had their the Yukon Kuskokwim people at the table at the beginning 20 years ago, just think how many chums, how many king salmon the last 20 years has been taken as bycatch. And so, you know, you take it and at compound those times 20, it's devastating. The numbers are, you know, they're not good. And I also have friends on the other side of the aisle, you know, some of the trawler guys. I'm friends with quite a few of them, and I'm considerate because nobody wants to put anybody out of business. That's never our intent. But not only should you put me out of business, but you shouldn't prevent me from eating my diet or having my food. And so I think that's a God-given right, first and foremost, to be able to feed your families and take care of your people in their communities. And I don't know how our elders in our village would deal with, oh, you can't go out and hunt and fish anymore. I don't think that would go over very well. As it hadn't gone over well at Yukon Kuskokwim for a reason. I mean, that's their way of life. I had an opportunity to go up and spend time up in St. Mary's a year ago, January. And I really got a better feel and understanding about the Yukon, you know, the people that live in that area, the Waikat area. And it's, you know, they go up, I go commercial fishing and you know, we make a fairly decent season but typically the commercial fishermen in the Yukon Kuskokwim, they normally, their boat grosses on their skiffs is what my crew make, you know, is my crew shares. And so they're not asking for a lot, even from a commercial fishing perspective, you know, they don't, you know, they just want to make enough to live throughout the winter, 10, 20, 30 grand, whatever it may be. But a couple of the younger guys that I got to know up there really well, became close friends with them. It's been really difficult, you know, working at the air service they were at. You know, they had to make a choice between, you know, going by food or diapers for their kids with their $50 they had left, or put gas in a snow machine to go see if they could find some moose antlers to sell and make more than what they had. So you know, I'm very concerned about, you know, the way what they're dealing with. I just wish that hadn't got to the point that it is. And you can't blame the indigenous people or the native people for creating the problem that's there now. I think it's if everybody would have been working together 20 years ago, and that's all we ask for now is, you know, hear our indigenous voice. We have something to offer. I mean, we've been, you know, here for 10,000 years, 5,000 years, whatever the number may be. The bottom line is that we've learned something, and by not including indigenous and traditional knowledge as being so disrespectful to my elders, to our ancestors, to, you know, I've seen, you know, boom and boost and boom on Kodiak Island, you know, king crab fisheries, Tanner crab fisheries, and you know, king crab fishery, you know, Kodiak Island at one time was the biggest king crab fishery in the world at one time. And then when it got shut down, there was no study, no research, no nothing, just close that chapter and move on. And how many years later, you know, what happened in the Gulf is happening in the Bering Sea, you know. So I think if indigenous and traditional knowledge was involved, I think it would be a little, it wouldn't be perfect, but it would be better than what it is, because we wouldn't need as much, you know. We'd want to be a little more, I guess that's the thing that I would say about indigenous traditional knowledge is that, you know, we'd be more conservative. We wouldn't be as greedy. We wouldn't need as much to survive. But industry too is at fault. I mean, for what's happening there too. There's no question. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Freddie. We have one last question. I mean, we are almost out of time, but I was wondering if Rachel, you wanted to briefly touch on Hayo's question.
Yeah, so Hadjo, I'll see you next week and maybe we can talk about this in person, but it's a good question. And I did want to, maybe I can just briefly mention, I think there is a growing awareness. I think decision makers want to feel like they're being fair, and the best way to do that is to be objective and rely on neutral data. And they think of quantifiable data as neutral data, but there's a paper that just came out this year by Guin that talks about the limits of data, and it's worth it's worth taking a look at. And I think it raises the point of, I think what I was trying to make in my talk around the limits of quantifiable data, and then the invisibility of the values that underpin that. So, Hadjo's specific reference to, Western science in partnership with Indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge. There have been some good positive steps, particularly at the North Pacific Council, with developing a protocol for how to do that appropriately, how to include that knowledge appropriately in that space. But I would just be mindful that we can't expect science, I think, to make some of the most difficult decisions around what's fair and what's equitable. And I hope I didn't come across that. Certainly we need more social science, and we need more comprehensive assessments, but social science can't solve this problem. And there are good steps in terms of investing in leadership. So yes, we need scientific capacity and support, but we also need leadership. We need that support at all levels. And I think a good example of a positive step is the recent creation of a senior tribal advisor in NOAA. The first time ever, we have Zach Penny to help kind of guide that agency in this type of challenging work. That being said, I think it's going to take more than one person. So let's follow up next week, Hadjo, and I hope I made sense there. I know we're short on time, but I appreciate the question. It's a good question.
Great. Well, thank you again, Freddie, Rachel, and Harmony, for sharing your knowledge with us today. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in with us today, and for sharing space with us. Please remember that you can view the recording for this webinar on the YouTube page of CRCD. So that brings us to the end of our webinar for today, and this is the last one for the semester. So we'll see you in the fall, and take care, everyone.